So again, a big welcome to everybody here. I'll be introducing you to Previz. Some of you I know already, some of you I haven't met before. So great to meet you. I'll aim to be speaking for no longer than 30 to 45 minutes. And afterwards, you'll have an opportunity to ask me any questions. To save those for the end, we'll put aside about 15 minutes or so to get through those. Now, just as a side note, this webinar will be recorded and we will be sending you links via email once we're done today. So if you do miss a step, not to worry. So without further ado, let's jump in here. Previz, the main website, if you don't already know, is at www.previz.co. You should already know this because you've all registered for the webinar. So well done. And thank you once again. We have a case study section, and there's a number of projects that have been using Previz. They vary from touring projects, which we'll discuss in a moment. We have girl bands, if you're a fan of Little Mix. We have architectural mappings with projection, as well as some pretty high profile events down below. Now, I'd just like to jump into the Fast and Furious Live World Tour. This recently premiered at the O2 Arena in London, and it's a 5-year tour from what I understand. And you can see it's a great idea. You have cars lined with LED, you have floors being projected onto, and massive walls being mapped as well. So this is a pretty ambitious project, and Previz was used from concept right through to delivery. That's why I'm showcasing this project in particular. Previz was not only used within one part of this production, it was used every step of the way. And the big idea here is to really bring your ideas to life. If I scroll down here, there's an image I quite like here. The cars are ready to go and they're being tracked with black tracks, if you've come across that system. We have a projection mapped wall, a projection mapped floor. So with Previz, the Fast and Furious live show was planned and sequenced well in advance and presented to teams and to the client every step of the way. That's the big idea here as well, that you're sharing progress as the production develops. Now, there's another photo I just wish to highlight. Here we see a capture of the real world. There's cars whizzing through these rising stage elements. Those two are being mapped as well. So we're dealing with a couple of key ingredients here. We have audience viewpoints. We have different scenic configurations. And how do we map content across the surfaces? Those are three big questions, and if we don't answer those well in advance of the show, we may go ahead and bump into unforeseen technical challenges. And let's face it, we've all been there. So that's where Previz really comes into play. We can actually build looks for the show well in advance, and not only sketching a show, but actually building this accurately and sharing this online, which I'll get to in just a moment. So by all means, use Previz to present your projects directly to your clients and elevate your portfolio to the next level. Now over towards the top here we have a glimpse of what Previz actually is. We'll be diving into Previz shortly, but here the team, the content team, producers could realize their project, and by all means use this for projection and complex stage designs. Integrate Previz into your content workflow to help inform your creative process. Now here I have a demo project called Car Projection, and I can move throughout my scene. It's a 3D viewer, and this is directly in my web browser. I can also map content. Sorry, I'm just going to move this out the way. I can also map content using a simple drag and drop interface. And over to the right, you can see here we have the car unwrapped in texture space, and within Previz, there it is applied to the 3D surface. So we'll learn how to do so as we move through this webinar. Also, there's a subtle button which we're going to be exploring called Share, and this is a really key feature. You can keep everyone in the loop by sharing your Previz project with guests, as well as teams and collaborators. But here we can invite guests, an unlimited number of guests, to easily get feedback, sign off and approval from key clients. So more on that later. So that gives some context to Previz, and we're going to now dig into how to create a Previz project. Now, first off, you'll need either Blender or Cinema 4D. The good news is Previz integrates directly into both. Here I have a Blender project, and it's pretty simple. We have 3 screens, so we need mesh objects. I have a center screen, house left, and house right. And the second key ingredient is textures. So you'll see a texture is being mapped to all 3 screens. And if I open up my UV layout, it's actually a 2K canvas, which is being mapped onto the 3D mesh. This is happening via UV mapping. If you're not familiar with the term UV mapping, it really allows us to project a 2D texture onto the 3D mesh. Something you can learn about online, but for now, I'm just going to be dipping into these key components that you'll need to create your Previz project. So UV maps are key, mesh objects are key, and we need a texture which would have been created in either Photoshop or Illustrator. Now, if I select this center screen and hit Tab to go into edit mode, you'll see that it has a corresponding UV shell. So we're actually sampling the center region of the canvas here. This information is all part of the UV map called feed_all. So the middle space is being sampled, and if I go ahead and select the left screen here, again hit Tab to enter edit mode, the button is found at the bottom here. It too has a corresponding UV shell, and the same goes for our right hand screen. Now if you look carefully as well, all of those screens, they share a UV map called feed_all. And that's a subtle but very important point. Because all of those screens share the same UV map name, it means that within Previz, we can map a single texture across all 3 screens just by having the shared name. So bear that in mind when you're building your Blender project. So again, mesh objects, textures, and UV maps are key. Now I'm just going to jump for a moment to compositing layout. Okay, something which we're now covering as part of the webinar is a broad overview as well of how to create textures for props. If I zoom out here, you'll see we have this basin, let's call it basin for want of a better word. Broadly speaking, it's categorized as a prop, and it has a texture that's already been created. Here I have a material called diffusion. The screens themselves, they have their own material called emission. Now diffusion here, it comprises an image texture node, a diffusion node, and a material output node. The key here is when you're building your scene, by all means add a light. I have a light here. And that light can interact with the prop because the prop itself has a material applied, and that's using a diffuse shader. That's the key. It's the diffuse shader that enables this interaction of the material with the light source. Also, you'll notice that, well, Blender has a number of render engines. Cycles render is not enabled by default. You need to select this manually. And this is my preferred render engine because it utilizes ray tracing algorithms. So I can quickly render light sources to a texture within Blender. Now, this will be either CPU or GPU based, depending on how you configure Blender itself. That's quite an involved topic. I'm just simply dipping into those components, but just take note, enable your cycles render engine, add a light to your scene. You can preview that over here in rendered mode. And then create a material, and that material is going to include a diffuse shader to begin with, and then as you get more confident with Blender, or it could be Cinema 4D that you're using, you can go ahead and start adding more nodes. Some to take note of, you'll have the mix shader, so you can composite multiple nodes together. Emission will ignore any diffusions. You can also start bringing in glass shaders for some transparency within your scene, and a whole lot more. So by all means, have a play. Again, we'll be making this project available to you shortly, so you'll have a base to work from. Okay, so once you've created your scene, you'll then need to somehow upload this project through to Previz. So over on the main website, let's have a quick look here. We have an integrations page. Okay, so I'm within my account. I have an integrations tab. And here you'll see you have the option to download a plugin, either for Cinema 4D or for Blender. Okay, it's worth revisiting this chapter, this section of the website often, because the plugins do get updated. Now I have downloaded the Blender plugin already. You can see it here in my downloads folder. It's zipped. If we're working on the Mac side, you don't need to unzip this. Okay. As a side note, we do offer support on the Windows side as well if you are using Windows 2. Now within Blender here, let's jump back to our default view. Okay, notice to the right I have a scene tab here, and that features a Previz collapse. If I hit refresh, you'll see that I can actually now talk with my Previz account. But to enable this direct compatibility, we'll first need to download the add-on, and then within Blender, hit File and select User Preferences. You'll have an add-ons tab over at the top here and a search bar. Let's just stretch that out. Okay, now I've installed this add-on already, but just notice, I'll take you through the steps. We have a drop-down arrow to the left and a checkbox. If I uncheck this box, I disable the add-on. You'll need to check this manually. Now the add-on is one thing, but also you'll need a token. You should be able to gain access to a token once you have a Previz account. Now, perhaps you may know this already, but just to be absolutely clear, if you don't have a Previz account, it's just worth checking into the Previz homepage, and you have the option to sign up to Previz here if you haven't already done so. I'll be coming back to that a little bit later on. Now, if I select tokens down at the bottom, I actually jump here, one tab to the left of integrations, I have an API field, and I can generate tokens. And we can go ahead and copy this serial, and you'll end up pasting this directly into Blender. The same method will apply for Cinema 4D. Once you've done so, remember to hit Save User Settings, and then you can close that window. And then you should then have the Previz collapser available to the right. And this is neat, I have to say. You can have teams, so we can have a number of teams linked to a single account. I have a team, which you may recognize from some of the video tutorials. We have Dandelion and Burdock, and we have Sensel Studio. And we can sync the project to one of those teams or multiple teams. Here I can preview projects already within that account belonging to that specific team. And also, I can create multiple scenes. This is especially useful if you wish to narrate multiple chapters of a production. And with regards to Fast and Furious, if you go and see the show, you'll see it that it features a whole host of different scenes with different stage elements, like the risers, which we previewed briefly. So this is a preview of existing scenes, a preview of existing projects, a preview of existing teams. But notice the clipboard to the right, you can create new projects. You can also create new scenes. You can refresh Blender to capture any new data already collated within Previz, and you can push information directly to Previz by hitting Publish Scene. Okay, similar methodology will apply to Cinema 4D. So it's really quick and easy to push and upload your projects to Previz. So without further ado, let's actually look at Previz, because we've spoken a lot about it. Let's jump right in here. Now I have the project already created. Let's jump back. Where are we? Here we go. Demo stage. Before actually looking at the components here, if I go back just one level, as you sign into Previz, just a brief note about the main interface. You'll have your projects laid out. Okay, I have 4 here. And just by selecting a thumbnail, you gain access to the particular project. So it's pretty straightforward. There's nothing too complicated here. Now just take note that I am working within a web browser. Previz is browser based. That's the power here. And a browser supporting WebGL is the way to go. And Previz runs best on Google Chrome. So that's my preferred browser anyway. So here we are. We have our 3D scene, and I'll just outline navigation controls. So first off, you can orbit by holding down the left click on your mouse, just dragging your mouse like so. If you dolly your camera by holding down the right click on your mouse, and you can also zoom in and out just by scrolling your mouse wheel backwards and forwards. You do also have trackpad control. Again, use the left click to orbit a selected object. Zoom in and out just by, on a MacBook Pro, I'm using a 2-finger swipe backwards and forwards. And you can dolly by using the right click on your trackpad. So not too dissimilar to the mouse. And for more information about navigation controls, just check out the user guide, which I'll point you guys to at the end here. Now I'm in the viewer. That's my 3D environment. If we go one tab along, we have scene config. So here we can configure the scene that we would have uploaded from Blender or Cinema 4D. First and foremost, you can name your scene. You can also add new scenes directly here within Previz. So you don't have to go from Blender or Cinema 4D, you can do so directly in Previz. You can download scenes as JSONs as well and replace them directly, as well as deleting them. So you do have full control here. Now tracks, if you're familiar with a keyframe, if you're familiar with a linear timeline, then the way tracks and sequencing works within Previz shouldn't be too dissimilar. We can have multiple tracks within Previz. We can name those as well. So we'll look at the sequencing a little bit more in a moment. Now, one tab along, you have maps. It's a single tab and it's very powerful. Perhaps the most powerful feature here within our builder. Notice all of the mesh objects in my scene are listed here: screen house right, screen center, screen house left, and we have a mapping applied. So feed_all. That's the UV map that we created over in Blender. Also, we have other mappings available to us. For example, if we select here feed_all and change this to direct center, now I'm mapping that entire texture only to center screen. So actually the UV map becomes the mapping component within Previz, and that's key. You can also then select a default texture that you wish to apply to the screen. We can override that by sequencing, which we'll look at a little bit later. And over to the right, you have a default timeline opacity, which we can play with as well. So this will change the screen's default opacity level from fully opaque to fully transparent. Now masks here, I do have a basic mask. If we apply this to center screen, so you can cut away surface area. This is using an alpha channel. You'll see the alpha rendered as black within the UI here, simply based on web browser limitations. Just bear in mind that your mask requires the alpha. This could be useful if, for example, you have a my strip array. Rather than building separate my strips within Blender, use a rectangle and then mask away elements to give the look and feel of a my strip array. Just a little tip, something that I've done myself before. Now, one to the right here, we have pixels. So quite neat, you can simulate the look and feel of LED. If I hit the assign button, we have a default library of pixel maps. So let's select a big fat square. Okay, there it is. And you can also decide whether you wish to have transparency enabled and how many of these pixel maps do we wish to array. Now, further to the right, you have cameras. I have 3 camera bookmarks. Those can be reordered. And something I should actually really explain is, well, why do we have camera bookmarks? The obvious answer is you may wish to jump from house left to house right quickly and easily in front of your client. So by all means, build those camera bookmarks, and you can cycle through those using the arrows available to you over here in the viewer. We have a neat annotation telling us exactly which bookmark we're sitting on. Now, something I really like is I can edit those cameras quickly and easily. Just by moving the camera here now within the viewer, you're actually updating the camera position. By then relocking the bookmark, you're storing that position. Also, something else worth noting is field of view. We can affect the field of view, particularly useful if you're doing a broadcast show. How may content look? Not to the local audience, but to the audience at home. So by all means, start bringing in different fields of view, and they're specific to each camera bookmark. You can also affect the clipping plane on the near and far, which can be useful if you're dealing with objects of different scales. So that's cameras in a nutshell. Just one last tab to the right, you have settings. So pretty basic stuff. You can change, for example, the background color here. And down at the bottom, something that I've actually only recently come across, we have again our meshes listed, but the mappings that are associated with each of those mesh objects. And again, just remember that those mappings are the UV maps, which we glanced briefly in Blender. And the same will apply for Cinema 4D. Okay, now a neat toggle as well is you can choose whether you wish to include those within the timeline or not. So you have an assets management available here as far as mappings go. So that brings us onto content. How can we how can we manage content in Previz? So by selecting the content button, you open the media library. Here I have assets available to me either in a list view or in a grid view. Each view has its own merits. In list view, you can preview the asset type, whether it's an image or a video. You can preview when it was last modified and the size. Okay, that can be important too. Now, a key question here is, what are the supported video codecs and formats? Well, Previz natively supports H.264s, formatted to QuickTime movies and MPEG-4s. But not to worry, if you haven't done that, then Previz will automatically transcode media for optimal playback in the viewer. Also, just note that if you wish to upload media, you have an upload button, but to the right, there's a drop-down arrow. So you can upload from the local computer here or from Dropbox. And that's neat because you could very well have the wider content team already using Dropbox. We know this is common throughout. So by all means, you can grab that media from a shared Dropbox and bring it nice and neatly into your Previz project. Now, something I quite like is over in thumbnail view, we have this options tab. I can actually view the asset in a new tab pixel perfectly, just to verify it's uploaded, it's fully in, and it's looking how it should. Okay, so that's the content tab in a nutshell. Now, as far as image formats go, PNG and JPEG is the way to go. Right, let's jump out of there. And let's consider then, once we have brought in our media, how do we sequence that? So you have a sequencer button here. So we're not only building our scene, we're actually sequencing looks. Now again, this is a linear timeline. It's working in hours, minutes, seconds, and frames. And perhaps the first thing I should point out is it's located here at the bottom. I can select and drag the bar down here. I'm just sliding this along and I'm zooming in and out of my track. That's neat. Also, you have a red line, that's your playhead position. And its precise position is being outlined across this guy down here. Okay, so that's neat. And if I zoom that out a bit more, okay, you can see here we're at 0 and we can continue. And there we have some media. We have a module, and that's applied to a layer. So we can have multiple layers within our project. We can name those layers. If we wish to composite media, I can call this layer 2. I can call this guy, for example, layer 3. And we can then go ahead and drag and drop content directly onto the timeline and specifically onto a layer like so. Notice as I drag that module, the start time is updating. So you can either do so here directly within the UI or specify a start time in seconds. That module should resize to match the video clip duration, but you can also resize that just by specifying a duration. Now notice we don't see the media applied to screen because we need to set a mapping. Again, there are the mappings pre-configured within Blender via the UV mapping. So if we take feed_wings, well, there's Wolfie, let's call him Wolfie, and he's mapped only to the sides. As I drag my playhead across, we have media also stemming from layer 1, and we see it visible across center screen. And as I move that playhead further along, we've now exited module 2. We can now only see content being played back from layer 1. So it's very straightforward, it's very quick and easy to bring media into Previz and to sequence this. If you wish to remove a module, hit the delete module button. I like that it gives you a confirmation, just so you're absolutely sure. And also just take note, there's a cog. You may all be wondering what the cog does. I know I did for a while. If you hit that cog, you also have opacity here. So if you're actually compositing media, you can decide whether you wish that layer to be fully opaque, semi-transparent, or fully transparent. Okay, so that's opacity levels here as well. Something useful to know. Also, just bear in mind that if you are playing back audio, make sure to have audio enabled. And the play button finally is available to the left over there. So that's pretty quick and easy. You can also read all the layers just by selecting and dragging those, rather like we did with camera bookmarks. Okay, good. So let's delete that layer, and we don't need that one now. Can delete that too. Keep this nice and clean. Let's jump back to our default bookmark. Okay, good. So, well, that's sequencing in a nutshell. Okay, and just to be absolutely clear, you can sequence once again multiple tracks within a project, but also bear in mind that you can share the project. Okay, that's a key feature here. I can invite guests. I can invite any number of guests. This isn't a paid-for feature. It's not an add-on. It's there. It's ready to use. And that's key because I can share with a guest, a client, and they can preview a project over on their phone or their iPad or their Samsung Galaxy or whatever device. Okay, so long as we have an active network connection. That's key. Now, something else worth mentioning, if we jump out of this project, if I dial into here to my dashboard, I'll just outline some other UI elements because we looked at how to share with guests, but if I drop down Teams and dive here into, for example, Sensel Studio, well, the projects we glanced earlier, we can see those here as well. We can access those here too. But importantly, I can choose whether I wish to invite not only guests, but team members as well as administrators. So members can upload content, they can access the timeline, they can upload scene data. Admins have full access to the full directory of projects and user and team permissions. Okay, whereas guests, this is a read-only access to a specific project. So you do have different permission types available to you. Okay, good. Now, lastly, now that you've watched this webinar, I just want to outline some support that you can access from the main website. Okay, let's have a look. So, we've looked at case studies. Over to the right, if you hit support, here you can gain access to articles written by Niall Thompson, Previz founder. Now, these articles are succinct. By all means, read those to recap what you may have learned within the webinar, such as viewer requirements. Okay, there it is, WebGL. Now, also, there is a nifty chat dialog box. So you can have a conversation with a Previz team member directly. No waiting on emails. Okay, that's really neat as well for immediate feedback and interaction with a Previz team member. Okay, now like I say, you will gain access to a recording of this webinar. We'll upload this shortly. That pretty much is a wrap. That takes me towards the end of the webinar. I will also just say, now that I'm thinking about it, you do have video tutorials you can watch as well. A handful of videos just to recap what we've covered here in the webinar in a little more detail. Okay, and that's, wow, time has flown. So I hope that's been informative for you. I'm going to stand by here. Please use your chat box. If you have any questions whatsoever, then by all means, ask away and I'll be more than happy to answer as best I can. So over to you guys.